إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. ثم أما بعد. Last week we discussed the story of Musa عليه السلام, which was relevant because it fell on a day that Allah Jalla wa Ala granted Musa عليه السلام and his followers victory over the Fir'aun, the day of Ashura, which fell in the month of Muharram, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved and protected Musa alayhi salam and granted Islam victory over oppressors and transgressors and those that claimed to worship others besides Allah, those that claimed themselves to be Allah Jalla wa Ala. Some of the scholars of tafsir, like Ibn Kathir and Al-Qurtubi and many others, they say that Muharram, or rather Ashura, happened to be the day where Allah Jalla wa Ala granted security, granted protection and freed, saved a number of prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Although some of these statements are based upon many Israeliyat, many statements or testimonies of the people of the book, they say that Nuh alayhi salam was saved on Ashura. They say that Yunus was saved from the whale on Ashura. They say that Musa alayhi salam was saved on Ashura. Muharram being thus a month of victory, a month of freedom, a month where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved and protected his ummah. So we discussed the story of Musa alayhi salam, the incidents that took place in his life from when he was born alayhi salam until when Allah Jalla wa Ala gave him victory over the Fir'aun. Today, inshallah ta'ala, I would like to take and extract a few lessons from the story of Musa alayhi salam. For it is only befitting that the story that is mentioned the most in the Quran, over 23 times the story of Musa is mentioned. And Musa, a prophet, that is mentioned over 130 times in the Quran. To the extent that Ibn al-Qayyim and some of the other scholars of Islam, they say a third of the Quran is about Musa alayhi salam. A third of the book of Allah Jalla wa Ala is about Musa alayhi salam, which shows there is some significance about his story, which shows there are certain lessons in his story that is entirely relevant for this ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We show that every single one of us can relate to an incident in the time of Musa. And thus the lessons of Musa become extremely pivotal in the salvation of each and every single one of us individually, and then the salvation of this ummah as a whole. So what are some of the lessons that we can take, and we can discuss, and we can benefit from? From amongst the lesson that we can take from the story of Musa alayhi as-salam is that Allah Jalla wa Ala has prohibited oppression in all of its forms. The Fir'aun was a mighty oppressor, someone who transgressed the rights of every single person in Egypt, and someone that transgressed the rights of Allah Jalla wa Ala. Some of the scholars of Islam, they used to say there was no one before Fir'aun that claimed to be Allah Jalla wa Ala, that called the people to worship him because he claimed to be Allah Jalla wa Ala. He made a lofty, lofty building for which he stood up and challenged Allah Jalla wa Ala. He transgressed, he was an oppressor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited in the Hadith al-Qudsi oppression in all of its regards for himself, and oppression amongst others in the dunya as well. And thus, if we look and analyze our situations, oppression doesn't just mean we oppress those that we are or have control over. Oppression doesn't just mean we oppress servants, but there is oppression in the workplace, there is oppression at homes, there is oppression in businesses, there is oppression with our dialogue amongst our believers. Oppression is defined by some of the scholars of Islam, whereby you take some of the rights of mankind, or you don't grant them their right that they deserve. This is oppression. And so a person can oppress his business partner by taking from him what belongs to him. Or a person can oppress his wife or her husband by not giving them the rights that they deserve in terms of food and wealth, a place to live, the nourishments of life, etc., etc. A person can oppress their parents by not being dutiful towards them. A person can oppress their children by not granting the rights of ilm that they deserve, of tarbiyah that they deserve. Oppression can manifest itself in many ways at all, in many ways, shape or form. And thus Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the story of Musa, He tells us about a real, a true, mighty oppressor who took from the rights of the slaves of Allah Jalla wa Ala and then tried to take the right of Allah Jalla wa Ala. He says in the Hadith al-Qudsi, Ya ibadi, inni haramtu dhulm ala nafsi. O my slaves, I have prohibited dhulm upon myself. وَجَعَلْتُهُ بَيْنَكُمْ مُحَرَّمًا فَلَا تَظَالَمُوا. And I made dhulm upon you haram, so never ever transgress. We learn from the story of Musa the situation of the one who oppressed, how he oppressed, and what came upon him after he oppressed. For Allah Jalla wa Ala says, فَأَخَذْنَاهُ وَجُنُودَهُ فَنَبَذْنَاهُمْ فِي الْيَمِّ فَانظُرْ كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الظَّالِمِينَ. We took him and his soldiers and we destroyed them. Look to how is the end, or look to the reward, look to the punishment of those who are known as zalimin, those who oppress. So from the lesson, from the story of Musa, from a lesson that we can take from it, is the severity of dhulm and the situation of every single zalim upon this earth. Allah prohibits dhulm upon Himself. And He's made a case study for us to learn and read in the Quran, the story of Fir'aun, who was a zalim, and what came upon him due to his oppression. He mentioned Jalla wa Ala, كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الظَّالِمِينَ. Look to how the people who committed dhulm, committed oppression, look to what happened to them. Look to Musa, look to Fir'aun, look to what happened to him due to his dhulm. And thus dhulm, our brothers in Islam, when a person oppresses anyone from this world, or takes their right, or doesn't grant them what they deserve, he is following in the footsteps, eating from the same fruit, walking upon the same path as the leader of oppression, Fir'aun himself. From the lesson that we can take from the story of Musa is how Allah Jalla wa Ala protects and grants security towards His slaves. We look to the story of Musa, we learned last week that the Fir'aun, he intended to kill every single male child that was born in a particular year. And he sent his troops, his army, to every single household to kill every single young boy, and to sit with the women who were pregnant, and to wait until they gave birth to see who was the boy so that they could kill them. Until the streets of Egypt was flowing with the innocent blood of young baby boys. Yet, we learn something from the story of Musa. And that is, when Allah Jalla wa Ala decrees something, when Allah prescribes something, no one and nothing can ever overcome it. Allah Jalla wa Ala decreed And he showed Fir'aun in his dream that a young boy will be born in that year. And he will overcome the Fir'aun. And his kingdom will overcome the kingdom of Fir'aun. And he will worship Allah Jalla wa Ala. So when the Fir'aun tried his utmost to falsify this dream, to make sure this doesn't happen, when Allah prescribes something, it will come to pass. But some of the scholars of Islam, they say, Allah Jalla wa Ala could have easily allowed Musa and his mother some privacy and some security in their own homes, and allow Musa to be raised in the family of his mother. But why did Allah Jalla wa Ala decree for Musa to be raised in the family of the Fir'aun? Why was this done? Why was this the case? And they mention a very beautiful point here. And they say, to show mankind, and to show the oppressors, and to show those who fight against Allah Jalla wa Ala, that you can try your utmost to defeat the words of Allah, and to defeat the religion of Allah, and to plot against Allah. But Allah's plan is greater. And to further humiliate oppressors and transgressors and those who try to defeat the Ummah of Islam, Allah humiliated the Fir'aun, not just by allowing a boy to survive, but allowing that boy to survive in the family of Fir'aun. And this shows us a lesson, our brothers in Islam. And that is, no matter how many times the enemies of Islam plot and plan against Islam and the Muslims, and no matter how many times we become sad and we feel sorrow for the situation of Muslims across the world, know that they are oppressing Islam and oppressing Muslims. And know that there is a decree of Allah Jalla wa Ala that He has prescribed somewhere in this world. He has prescribed somewhere or sometime during this life that we are living, whereby the promise of Allah, أَلَا إِنَّ نَصْرَ اللَّهِ قَرِيبٌ, that the victory of Allah Jalla wa Ala is going to be close. And thus we must believe in the victory. And we must have absolute comfort and absolute sincerity in this victory that is promised. And this victory is further emphasized in our hearts when we read the story of Musa alayhi salam. When we read the story of Musa alayhi salam, and we understand where he was raised. He was raised in the house of the very one that ordered and commanded all of the troops of Egypt to kill young baby boys. From the benefits we can learn from the story of Musa alayhi salam is that whenever truth and batil, whenever truth and falsehood are fighting against one another, truthfulness will always overcome falsehood. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَلِيُمَحِّصَ اللَّهَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَيَمْحَقَ الْكَافِرِينَ. That Allah Jalla wa Ala will always give victory to the ones who are truthful. And He will always make truth overcome falsehood. Ponder over the story of Musa, and ponder over the story of Fir'aun, and how Allah Jalla wa Ala prescribed victory in many different circumstances for Musa alayhi as-salatu was-salam. From the benefits we can learn, and the lessons that we can learn from the story of Musa, is that it is an inherited characteristic of the disbelievers, especially transgressors, to mock and insult the believers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The non-Muslims have with them an inherited disease, other than shirk and kufr, and other than disbelieving in Allah and not following Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And that is al-istihza' of al-mu'mineen. And that is mocking and slandering and insulting the believers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أَمْ أَنَا خَيْرٌ مِّنْ هَذَا الَّذِي هُوَ مَهِينٌ وَلَا يَكَادُ يُبِينٌ. When Fir'aun used to mock Musa and mock his believers and mock those who believed in Allah Jalla wa Ala, as was the case of Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab and the Quraysh who mocked Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as is the case of the non-believers today, the transgressors and oppressors, and those who are at the forefront of attacking Islam and the believers. They begin by insults, they begin by slanders, they begin by mocking Islam, our prophets, our messengers, the book of Allah Jalla wa Ala. It is an inherited disease of the disbeliever to mock Allah and His Messenger and the believers. As was the case of Fir'aun who mocked Musa and his believers. Yet Musa عليه السلام remained steadfast, he remained firm. And the believers should take the same route. Do not let the words hurt you. Do not let words change you. Do not let people mock you or insult you be a reason for that to bring you closer towards the wrath of Allah Jalla wa Ala. Rather, let it be a reason for you to have absolute conviction in the absolute truth of Islam. For this is the sunnah of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From the lessons that we can take from the story of Musa عليه السلام is to always be optimistic, is to always think good about the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Musa عليه السلام, when he stood as the magicians threw their sticks which transformed into snakes or looked as if though there were snakes coming towards Musa, he remained firm and steadfast. He believed that Allah would help him. So he threw his stick, one stick, compared to, some of the scholars mentioned 70,000 or 60,000 or more than that. He threw one stick, and one stick of his ate all of the other sticks. He was standing, Musa alayhi salam, at the dead end, at the end of the cliff, whereby there was nothing in front of him except for the sea. And behind him was the army of Fir'aun, approaching him with weapons to humiliate him and to kill and murder him. Yet he believed. He was optimistic. He thought well of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah Jalla wa Ala granted him salvation and security. As believers or brothers in Islam, whenever you're faced with a trial in this dunya, whenever you feel as if though the earth has closed up and is squeezing you to the extent that you cannot bear any longer, think about Musa alayhi salam. Think about how his mother felt when the troops of Egypt raided every home and killed every son. Yet she became, and she was steadfast. She was optimistic. She thought good about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Think about Musa alayhi salam, when he saw the believers of Allah Jalla wa Ala being crucified on the cross, with their arms and their feet and their legs being cut on the opposite sides. Yet he thought good about Allah Jalla wa Ala. And Allah Jalla wa Ala gave him victory. And not just in the terms of victory in terms of the deen of Allah Jalla wa Ala, but he gave himself Musa victory. And thus, whenever you as an individual feel as if though the world is squeezing you, you have problems with your wealth, you have problems at home, you have problems with your work, you have problems whatever it be from the dunyawi perspective, think good about Allah Jalla wa Ala. Remember the story of Musa alayhi salam and how Allah saved him. And Allah Jalla wa Ala will treat you exactly the same. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إن الله تعالى غفور رحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد. From the lessons and the final lesson that we'll take today, inshallah ta'ala, from the story of Musa alayhi salam, that is repeated the most in the Quran. A third of it, the Quran. A third of the speech of Allah that Allah Jalla wa Ala spoke to this ummah is about Musa alayhi salam. A lesson that we can take, in fact, a lesson that is repeated throughout the story of Musa. A characteristic that Allah speaks about with regards to Musa himself is that Allah continuously tells us and tells Musa not to fear and not to be afraid. Musa, one man, fighting against an evil transgressor, the Fir'aun and his entire army. One man that is described as an extremely muscular, strong individual to the extent, as we discussed last week, he hit somebody with a punch, and because of his strength, he killed him with a punch. Musa was a strong individual, a very muscular individual. Yet still, Allah Jalla wa'ala told him not to fear. He says, Jalla wa'ala, Ya Musa, aqbil wa la takhaf, innaka min al-aminin. He said, Jalla wa'ala, فَأَوْجَسَ فِي نَفْسِهِ خِيفَةً مُوسَى قُلْنَا لَا تَخَفْ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْأَعْلَى. Allah Jalla wa'ala says, أَقْبِلْ وَلَا تَخَفْ إِنَّكَ مِنَ الْآمِنِينَ. Go ahead and don't be afraid. You are of those who believe. Go ahead, don't be afraid. You are of those who believe. Allah Jalla wa'ala gives us a very important lesson through repeating these statements over and over again of telling Musa, don't be afraid, don't be scared. He tells us Jalla wa'ala that fear and removing fear is not synonymous with how your body looks or how strong you are outwardly. Musa was a strong man. Rather, fear can become overcome. Fear can become overcome. A person can overcome fear if he is a person that believes. Believes in what? Believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a belief that is absolutely certain in every single regard. Allah didn't just say to him, don't fear. Throw the stick and don't fear. وَلَا تَخَفْ إِنَّكَ مِنَ الْآمِرِينَ. Don't fear. Have you forgotten? You are from those who believe. وَلَا تَخَفْ. Don't fear. You are from those who believe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus the believers should take this lesson and imprint it in his heart. And that is as believers of Allah Jalla wa'ala, as those who believe in Allah, in His angels, in His books, in His messengers, in the Day of Judgment, in Qadr, in the pillars of Iman, fear should never overcome us. No doubt there is a natural type of fear that every single one of us had, that Musa had himself. A natural type of fear. But when this natural type of fear is diluted in the purity of Iman of Allah Jalla wa'ala, Iman of Allah overcomes absolutely all fear. And this is why when Allah Jalla wa'ala speaks about the believers, the Sahaba, when they are told about the disbelievers are going to overcome them, or the greatness of the army, it only increases them in faith. This is why the likes of Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali were mountains that stood in front of thousands of people, defeated them with their words, defeated them with their bodies, defeated them with their hearts, defeated them with their Iman. Iman, oh brothers in Islam, overcomes all types of fear. لا تخف إنك من الآمنين. Don't ever be afraid. You are from those who believe. And thus in every single problem that you find in this dunya, oh brothers in Islam, we're living at a time now where a number of the brothers who are working and sisters who are working are being furloughed. Some of them are being sacked and they have no ways of provisions for themselves or their families. لا تخف. Don't become someone who is drowned in their fear. إِنَّكَ مِنَ الْآمِنِينَ. You are from those people who believe. Taqwa of Allah Jalla wa'ala will open every single exit for you. And believing in Allah Jalla wa'ala will allow every single provision to open for you. Look to Musa, for when he believed, and when his belief overcame his fear, Allah Jalla wa'ala gave him salvation in this dunya before the akhirah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be and follow the example of the messengers and prophets that came before us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us conviction like Musa alayhi salam, to grant us conviction like the messengers and prophets that came before. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us Iman like the messengers and prophets that came before. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us victory like how He gave victory to the messengers and prophets that came before. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى ال محمد كما صليت على ابراهيم وعلى ال ابراهيم انك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى ال محمد كما باركت على ابراهيم وعلى ال ابراهيم انك حميد مجيد. اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنه وفي الاخره حسنه وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم اعز الاسلام والمسلمين. اللهم اذل الشرك والمشركين.
اللهم إنك عفو تحب العفو فاعف عنا. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. وصلى الله على النبي محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. وأقيموا الصلاة.